Another very warm welcome to Nancy Hennessy. We're thrilled that you're here today. She's an educational consultant. She's been offering her expertise and guidance on topics such as professional practices, student assessment, and instruction. She's a past president of the International Dyslexia Association and a recipient of the IDEA's Margaret Byrd Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award in 2011, which of course was 8 years ago, so still giving, still sharing, and we're thrilled that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I particularly want to thank Tim and his staff for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to be with all of you. There's nothing that I like more than to be with a group of educators and to have conversations about how it is that we serve the children that we work with, or even our own children sometimes, right? We'll make certain that you have opportunities to think about what it is that you're learning about today. Here are my hopes for today: that you'll be able to connect, reflect, and then act on some of what, not all of what you hear today, but some of what you hear today. I firmly believe that learning is our work as educators. That's Michael Fullen, not my saying. I've taken that to heart, and so yes, I'm still standing, and I'm still working because at heart I'm a teacher, and I'll always be a teacher. So here's today's purpose, and I'll just give you a moment to take a look at what I hope we'll accomplish today. It's always good to know what our purpose is so that we can anticipate and begin to organize up our thoughts. So we want to acknowledge the importance of instruction that's aligned with the science of reading, right? And so often, I think as we think about practice in classrooms, whether public, private, charter schools across the country, that instruction is not necessarily aligned with the science. And I guess the saying goes something like this: if not research, then what? So we have to be thinking about, why is it that we're doing things? Can we provide a rationale? Do we know that what we're doing will be effective? Because we're really holding children's lives in our hands. Okay. We also want to think about your knowledge base. And so Louisa Moats, and aren't you fortunate that she's coming for the Fox conference along with her colleagues. But Louisa often says, programs don't teach, teachers do, right? And I'm sure you've heard that before. And I'm not denying the importance of program, all right? Programs are important, but it's really our knowledge base that we bring to the program that allows for us to meet the needs of the children that we're working with. We want to identify the theoretical models of reading proficiency, because I can't talk about comprehension without all of us agreeing on how do we get to a place where our students are skilled readers? What does that look like? And then the complexity of comprehension. And I'll just briefly share with you, I was a decoding queen for many, many years, right? I was all about word recognition. In my past, I have OG training, I was a Wilson trainer, right? That was really my focus. And it's not that I neglected comprehension, but I certainly left that to someone else, right? In recent years, I've become more and more aware of not only how important comprehension is, I knew it was important, but the complexity of it. We really have figured out word recognition, right? We know what the components are, we know what the strands of the rope are, we recognize those. We have assessments that can give us information about, how do we get to automatic word reading, right? We have interventions that we can use. But comprehension, we're still working at it because it is so complex. So we're going to acknowledge that today. I don't really like this saying, but it's somewhat applicable. How do you eat an elephant? Not that any of us would want to, right? But how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So I want to say to you today, take this on one bite at a time, because I'm going to talk about a lot of things because comprehension is so complex. So think about your practice, think about those students you're working with, think about your own knowledge base, and don't try to do it all at once, right? I'm giving you the big picture today. Take what you can and keep working at it. That's what we do as educators. That's what we do as learners. We keep working at it, accumulating the knowledge base. I'm going to introduce a blueprint for you. It's a framework. I'm not going to give you a lesson plan today. I'm not about lesson plans. I'm not saying those aren't important either. But we need a framework that's based on the evidence that allows for us to think through how to develop our units of study and our lesson plans, and what strategies and activities we should use dependent upon where our students are at. So we'll talk about a blueprint. I'll get to that, I promise, but we're going to do a little background knowledge first, right? And then, of course, we're going to connect to evidence-informed strategies and activities. And we're going to talk about some flexibility in that area as long as we can answer the question, why did we choose that activity? Why did we choose that strategy? How does it align with what we know is a critical contributor to comprehension? So we're going to ask a lot of big questions today, and many of them you'll have the answers to. The hope here is that your Velcro strips are going up in your brains, right? And what you're able to do is maybe revise your thinking a little bit, but also elaborate and enhance on your thinking. I want to say to you that you'll have a different mental model. We'll use that phrase more than once today. You'll have a different mental model of comprehension when you leave. Because each time we engage in a learning opportunity, right, our concepts of that particular construct or idea shifts and changes just a little bit. Okay. You have support materials. I want you to be certain that you use your notebook. In your notebook, you're going to find a participant guide. You're also going to find a reading, The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy, right? And you're going to find a copy of most of the slides that you're going to be seeing today. Now, if something doesn't pop up, just know that I do what you do when you teach. You go over, you review, and you say, don't think I really want to talk about that, or I don't have enough time for that today. Or maybe I'm just going to change this a little bit now that I've thought some more on it. So there may be some slight changes, but not very many, I promise. Anything you don't have and you want from me, you can email me, and I'd be interested in hearing from you afterwards if you have additional questions. At the end of each section, we will stop. There'll be a periodic pause, both for you here in the room as well as those who are joining us virtually, all right? And we'll take some questions and we'll give you opportunity to talk with one another. All right. Of course, purpose has to include students, right? So, I just outlined for you purpose. Well, all of those things are important. Why? So that all of our students, including those who struggle, have the opportunity to acquire and be capable of using essential language and cognitive skills necessary for making meaning of the text. I have a colleague that I've known for a very long time, probably the very best principal that I ever worked with in a regional high school district. And he sent me an article that was published this past year in a journal I had never heard of. It's called the Journal of Servant Leadership. But that's kind of an odd name, isn't it? Has kind of a spiritual ring to it. And in fact, he's a very spiritual man. He wrote an article about teachers being servant leaders. And who are we serving? We're all constantly serving our students. And so I think that each of you are probably here because of a student or students that you've had in your classroom that you continue to think about and want to learn more about so that you can serve them. All right. The other reason you might be here is we all have a problem, right? We have a problem nationally, and I'm not going to go into all of the statistics, right? But the reality is whether you're looking at NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, and you're looking at the performance of students, whether they be 4th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, whether they be public, private, or charter, we're underperforming. A majority of our students do not read at proficient or advanced levels. And what are we asking them to do when they take a NAEP? It's like the nation's report card. What are they doing on those assessments? They're having to read for meaning. Now, yes, they have to be able to read the words, right? But if they can read the words, then they have to be able to make meaning to respond to the questions that are being asked. And many of our students can only do that at a very basic level. They can respond at more or less a literal level, maybe make some simple inferences. They're not able to integrate information easily, and you have to be able to do that when you're reading text and trying to make meaning. They're not able to draw conclusions. They're not able to make judgments. They're not able to apply that knowledge that they're gaining from their reading. So that's a real problem, right? So nationally, we have a problem, but I'd also challenge you to be thinking about your own students and your state data. And if we have a problem, then how are we going to solve it? We have to solve it. Our students have the right to read. We have the responsibility to teach them. So I'm sure that's why you're all here today, because you want to continue to be able to think through and add to your expertise in terms of what you do every day. So we always have to be thinking about background knowledge, right? Everybody says background knowledge is the bomb when it comes to comprehension. That's the new thing, isn't it? Well, the reality is it is very important. There are lots of publications, a new book. Natalie Wexler has a new book out, if you haven't seen it, The Knowledge Gap. It's pretty good, okay? Each and every time we come to a learning situation, we have to make connections to what it is that we know, or we have to build a background knowledge so that we can make those connections. As educators, we need to be informed. All our decisions need to be informed. So let's take a little bit of time to think about what's part of that foundational knowledge that all of us should have. And this is a Moats quote, surprise, surprise, all right? Expert teaching of reading and writing is only possible when the teacher knows not just the meanings conveyed by language, but how language itself works. So I will confess that I was quite naive when I first became a special educator. I remember taking a course in speech and language. It was all about the sounds of the language. And I remember thinking to myself, how am I going to use this? I really didn't have a clue how important oral language was, and how by understanding oral language, right, I would have a better understanding of written language, and also understand that I had to translate oral language into written language for my students. So I thought, because language is so important, particularly for comprehension, but certainly for word recognition as well, that we should be thinking about the fact that all of us need to know a great deal about language. I'm kind of a wannabe speech-language specialist. I've come to this late in my life, right? After realizing how important it is. Here's what Catherine Snow and her colleagues say about this language literacy connection. Literacy is a secondary system. So teaching our students how to read and write, that's a secondary system. And what's it dependent upon? It's dependent upon language. That's the primary system. So we're going to begin by thinking about the fact that our standards, all right, and unfortunately, you know, we don't have a lot of standards out there that really align with the science of reading. I mean, they're growing. States are becoming more and more aware of, right? But certainly IDA has taken the lead in this area. And our standards for all teachers of reading acknowledge the importance of language. They say to us that we ought to understand the language processing requirements of proficient reading and writing in these particular areas, and you can see it described there. We also need to understand structured literacy instruction, right? And in terms of what we're talking about today, specifically vocabulary and listening and reading comprehension. So let's do a quick lexicon check, since I'm beginning with a conversation about language, and it's very purposeful because I'm going to talk a lot about language comprehension today. Let's start with a lexicon check. This is in your participant guide, all right? And you can partner up with the person sitting next to you, or you can complete this individually and just quickly go through column A, your definitions, and column B, language systems. All oral, with the exception of orthography, and I'll give you a clue ahead of time here. That's your written system. All right, quickly complete. And here's a quick check for you, so you can quickly check. And as you're going through and taking a look at this, I want to point out to you that certain systems of language are more critical for word recognition, and others are more critical for comprehension, and there's also overlap, right? So quickly check, see how you did, and if you got them all right, pat yourself on the back, and if not, keep thinking about this. Keep thinking about what are these connections between language and literacy. right? And maybe this will help a little bit. So it all begins with oral language, and then what happens? Then we move to school, into school, right? And we begin to work with those skills, with those competencies that will allow for us to read words accurately and automatically, and to make meaning of the text. And so just thinking a little bit then about instructional connections. So phonology, of course, absolutely critical in terms of word reading and spelling, right? The building block of reading, words, phonological phonemic awareness. Morphology plays a dual role, doesn't it? It helps us not only read word, but it helps us in terms of vocabulary, determining the meaning of words. In fact, morphology is an independent word learning strategy. We'll talk some more about that today. Semantics. Well, overall knowledge of word meaning, our knowledge of figurative language, kind of these meaning networks that our students have to tap into as they come to text. Syntax, I wonder if you thought about that in terms of reading comprehension. So I am going to talk about grammar today. That's warning for those of you who are not into grammar, all right? I happen to love grammar, not from a mechanical point of view, from the perspective that syntax is a vehicle for conveying meaning. So we'll talk about that today. Of course, orthography has everything to do with being able to work with what the spelling system, the print system of our language, to be able to read words and spell words. And then there's pragmatics. And this is kind of a hard one to understand because in oral conversation, the intonation, the prosody of our speech kind of conveys, our tone, all right? And that's a little more difficult in written text, but authors do use pragmatics. For instance, think about quotation marks, think about exclamation points, think about just when they use certain phrases, how they can convey their meaning. A little different than oral language, not as obvious, but certainly important. And then discourse. So what is discourse? It's anything more than a sentence, right? So when we talk about discourse structures, we're really talking about text structures. In oral language, we're talking about conversation. But when we move over, right, into written language, we're talking about paragraphs and text structures and all that good stuff. So we have to be thinking about this knowledge of oral language developing over time, consistently throughout our lifetime, actually, right? And how we have a responsibility not only to develop that oral language, but to help our students translate it into written language, to understand the structure of written language, because written language is structured. Okay. Now, one of the things that we've come up against, as you all know, you wouldn't be here if you didn't recognize this first quote. There's been this disconnection, this profound disconnection between the science of reading and educational practice. That is changing. And it's changing because of the efforts in many states, the efforts of individuals and organizations such as the Dyslexia Center. And it needs to change because Louisa, for a long time, has been speaking to us, as have others, about the fact that, it's not enough to have an implicit understanding. We need an explicit understanding of what it is that we need to do each and every day in classrooms. So teachers cannot rely on their implicit understanding alone to teach reading. Explicit teaching requires explicit understanding. So the importance of teacher knowledge once again. So we need an instructional approach that is based in the language, that helps us translate oral language into written language, that conveys the structure of language. We need structured literacy. What is structured literacy? It's an approach that aligns with the evidence. It's based in the science. There is no disconnection. It directly reflects the science, as do those standards that I shared with you. It identifies the content and principles of effective reading instruction. So it speaks to us about some of those language systems we were just talking about. Phonology, for instance, semantics, syntax. But it provides us with a way of taking those language systems and translating them for our students. So it's highly explicit, it's systematic, it's cumulative, it's diagnostic. It's good for all kids, all right? It's good for all kids. but it's particularly good for the kids who are struggling. It also addresses all of the foundational and then the higher level skills. So it addresses word recognition, as well as those language comprehension competencies that are so necessary for comprehension. So let's just take a moment, all right, and think about what we've done so far, because it's always good to kind of recap, right? So we began this morning by setting purpose, by talking a bit about our students and problems that our students are encountering. And then we talked about these connections between language and literacy, these important connections, and that we need to be thinking about approaches that align with the structure of language, that align with the evidence. And structured literacy is such an approach. And there are many different programs that can fall under that umbrella. Okay. Want to move on to viewpoints on comprehension. So how many of you have seen this formula for reading? Okay, so a good number of you, right? Well, this is called the simple view of reading. And it is pretty simple, right? There's just two factors. And I'm sure you all walked in here having a sense of this. What is it that your students have to have in place, what competencies, in order for them to be skilled readers, AKA read with comprehension? Well, one, they have to have word recognition or decoding capabilities in place. That's one factor. The other factor is they have to have linguistic comprehension. In other words, they have to have language. They have to have meaning of word. They have to have background knowledge and a number of other things that allow for them, once they read the words, to make meaning. And Goff and Tummer say to us, these two factors, when we multiply them, they equal what? They equal skilled reading, AKA reading comprehension. Pretty simple. You take one away, right? If we used absolute values, 0 for decoding, times by 1 for linguistic comprehension. Well, 0 times 1 is 0, everybody, right? Or if we go the other way around, 1, I can read all the words, but I don't have language capabilities. 1 times 0 is still 0. So oftentimes when we begin to talk about comprehension, we start with, well, how do you get to a place where students are skilled in reading, right? And Hollis Scarborough, we're going to talk about her rope in a moment, says skilled reading really is all about this ability to read the words and make meaning simultaneously. Okay, good. Now, our focus today is not going to be so much on the decoding aspect, although we know we have to provide sometimes accommodations for our students who aren't able yet to read all the words. You're going to hear me talk about giving them access to age and grade appropriate texts to develop the language that they need to work with the texts at school, right, to make meaning. So that will be our focus. But I'm not saying it isn't important to continue to work with word recognition. Please don't think I would ever say that. Okay. All right. So if that's the simple view of reading, what exactly is reading comprehension? So I'm going to send you back again to your participant guide. And you have, I think this is number 2. I may get confused with the numbers, we'll see. And I want you to do a quick write. How would you define reading comprehension? That's a quick write, so you don't need to write a paragraph, just a few words. All right, let's be brave now. This is a risk-free environment, no judgment, right? We're here to learn together. Who would like to tell me how they defined reading comprehension?
The ability to read, understand, retell, and apply what you've read. And by apply, infer, predict, all of those other skills that I got from the text.
Okay, that's wonderful. So she gave us many skills, this ability to retell, the ability to apply, the ability to predict, the ability to make inference. Okay, thank you, Courtney. Anyone else? Yeah, thank you.
The ability to be able to see the words on the page to come alive in images.
Wow, the ability to see those words and let them come alive in images. Yeah. So these are all, thank you, Rachel, these are all things that we want our students to do, right? And I think the big question is, how do we get them to do that? So in many instances, we talk about the products, right? What we want our students to do, the way we want them to express their understanding. But how do we get them to do that? The Rand Reading Study Group says that comprehension is, it's really all about extracting and constructing meaning simultaneously. That sounds pretty active to me, right? It sounds like processes to me, right? The National Governors Association, the NAEP group, they talk about it being an active process, but they also talk about products, right? And then Carlisle says to us, Joanne Carlisle says, it's a process. So as I started thinking about reading comprehension, I started thinking about my own experience, right? And as teachers, we think about what do we want our students to be able to do? I'm going to propose to you today, that's important, but we have to think about what processes or skills do they have to have in place in order to do what we want. And so I was taken by this definition, so to speak. It's a compilation of research that, first of all, reminds us that comprehension is extremely complex. It is not, as some would say, a unitary construct, right? It's a lot of different theoretical models about comprehension, many with similarities, right? So it's complex. But it involves what? It involves a range of language and cognitive processes and skills. Those are necessary for the student to make sense of the written text. And I know it feels as if, well, what's the difference? You know, what's the difference between the process and the product? And it's kind of a fine line, but maybe this will help. The products of comprehension are the indicators of what the student or the reader knows and understands. It's what we ask them to do on tests, right? Or the way that we ask them to respond to a question. And those tasks are important because they give us a little window into whether or not the student is understanding. We can't really get into their heads so much, unless you're a neuroscientist like Tim, right, to understand exactly what's going on inside of their head. But inside of their head, they're using these language processes and skills, right? These are activities by which the reader arrives at the product. So I sometimes think about this. Think about a manufacturing facility, and think about a high-quality product that they want to produce. It just doesn't pop off the assembly line. There are lots and lots of processes, efficient and effective processes that have to occur in order to get to that high quality. So when I started thinking about comprehension in this blueprint, I started thinking about what are the theoretical models telling me about these processes? I mean, I can go to the standards and I can find all the products, right? The standards are all about products. But I'm wondering what the research, the evidence might tell us in terms of processes. And of course, I went right back to the reading rope. So how many in the room are familiar with the reading rope? Yeah, more and more. So the reading rope, of course, is the product of Hollis Scarborough, all right? And Hollis is a renowned researcher. And a number of years ago, Hollis was doing research on reading proficiency and looking at predictors of being at risk for reading failure or difficulty. And she identified varied predictors, both for word recognition and for language comprehension. And the rope represents those predictors. Now, she went a little further than the simple view, right? She elaborated on the simple view for us. Because the bottom part of the rope, which I have up here and up there, the bottom part of the rope has everything to do with that first factor, decoding or word recognition. And what goes into that? What are the strands? What are the necessary contributors in order for a student to be able to read words automatically, accurately and automatically? Any one of the strands frayed, what's going to happen with word recognition? Yeah, it's going to be problematic, right? Your kiddos are going to continue to struggle. She also identified language comprehension. Remember that linguistic comprehension? She also identified language comprehension capabilities, processes, right, that are necessary in order for a student to make meaning. And of course, the outcome is skilled reading. So what did she have to say? Well, let's just take a moment here. The first strand is background knowledge, right? So I like to use pipe cleaners to do this. And when I talked with Hollis about this, she said that's what she originally did. By the way, she designed the reading rope for parents and for educators. as a way of explaining something that is so complex, right? So we've got background knowledge, and I'll do them in this order, but they work together. Notice the strands of the rope are woven together, both for the bottom part of the rope and the top part, all right? So what's background knowledge all about? Well, it's about facts, concepts, beliefs, attitudes, right? But when you're reading a text, cultural, right? When you're reading a text, it's relevant to the text that you're reading. Prior knowledge is kind of the big barrel of everything that we know, all right? She also talked about vocabulary. Okay. And she said, we need to think about, and you'll see these terms again today, breadth, depth, precision. How many words do we recognize? Breadth. How many do we know deeply? Depth. Can we be precise? Authors are in our use of words. Can we be precise when we write something? That takes a depth of knowledge, right? She also talked about verbal reasoning. And when she talked about verbal reasoning, she was talking about things like, working with figurative language, but inference. Should think about that. If you want your kids to move beyond the surface of the text, if you want them to be able to understand what the author implied, if you want them to walk away with a mental model, this aggregation of all the units of meaning, right, across the text, they have to be able to make inference. She also talked about something called language structures. And when she talked about language structures, she said, you know what? It has everything to do with semantics and syntax. Oh, we came across those terms already, right? We built a little knowledge in that area, or surfaced it. What did she mean by that? Well, she was really talking about these networks of meaning that we have for words. Words are always embedded within a network. They're connected to background knowledge, word meanings. And she was talking about syntax and how syntax conveys meaning. So here's a little foreshadowing for you. What question does a part of speech, namely the noun, answer in a text? The answer is who or what. Parts of speech carry meaning. It's not just about the name of a person, place, or thing. They convey meaning. They are what Cheryl Scott called the worker bees of the text, the sentences. Okay. All right, and then she talked about literacy or print knowledge. And with our little ones, that begins with print awareness, and then we go on to discourse structures. Mentioned that word before, right? Different types of genre. Any one of the strands of the rope frayed, then comprehension may be in jeopardy. Now, I know we talk about vocabulary and background knowledge as being really critical, but these are all kind of interwoven with one another. And yes, today we'll talk about them as being separate, but the reality is when you teach a text, you're really relying on all of these different processes and skills to ultimately make meaning, and oftentimes they interact with one another. Okay, so I began by saying viewpoints on comprehension. I gave you a little different definition of comprehension, and what I'm trying to articulate for you is how come I thought that might be important, and where did I go in terms of the evidence, right? Now, the other place that I can go in terms of thinking about this is to the work of Kate Kane, right? So Kate Kane is a Brit. She's written quite a bit about comprehension, a lot about struggling comprehenders. And she also talks about levels of language processing. And she says the comprehension of written text involves processing language at many different levels. Right? I happen to love her work. I'm one of her groupies. Right? She says at the word level, the reader has to decode the word. But they also have to access the meanings of words they hear or read. Right? So they need a breadth and a depth of knowledge. Okay. At the sentence level, they need to work out the syntactic structure and the sense of each sentence. Do you ever think about how long some sentences are in text? How dense they are, lots and lots of different ideas? Yeah. We have to teach our kids how to work with those sentences. All right. And we've got a little reader down in the right-hand corner, and she's doing exactly that. She's reading a placard. It happens to be at a museum of science outside, and the placard is on dinosaurs. And she's reading the words, she's bringing forward the meaning of words that she knows. She's making sense of the sentences and how the sentences connect. In order to construct a mental model, what you walk away with your overall understanding, something that you can apply in the future, this aggregation of meaning, your enduring understandings, right? Not just your ability to retell word for word, because ask kiddos 2 weeks later, they can't do that. Ask them for their overall understanding, those big ideas that we want them to carry with them that they can apply. If they can answer that kind of a question, you've done your job. Okay, so in order to construct a mental model, what do they have to do? They have to integrate information from different sentences. I wonder how many of you have thought about sentence comprehension. You know, sometimes we think the breakdown is at the paragraph level. Sometimes it's at the sentence level, and they don't get how the sentences connect to one another. Benjamin Banneker was an activist. He wrote an almanac. Who's he? Oh, it's Benjamin Banneker. So we have these little cohesive devices that tie up meaning within and between sentences. Students have to be able to do that, all right? That's local coherence. They also have to incorporate their background knowledge, right? Because the author's not going to tell them everything. Many ideas will be implicit. That's how we get to a deeper understanding of text, by working through those different levels of language processing. So here's an infographic that represents that and kind of takes this apart a little bit more. And I have to tell you, I keep changing this. So I'm always changing as I read, but anyway, here's my best shot at this, all right? In the upper left-hand corner, you have some books. And in the right-hand corner, you have the placket again. That's Kayla, by the way, and she's reading, right? And there's always this interaction that's going on, an active process between the reader and the text. And you're setting purpose and context for students, right? All right. So they have to work with the words and phrases. And by the way, if you want them to learn the language of school, the language of the standards, the language of the workplace, then they're not reading decodable text. Not for comprehension. They're reading decodable text for word recognition. Different types of texts have different purposes. You want your students, your struggling comprehenders, your students who are doing fine, you want them reading age and grade appropriate text so that they're exposed to academic language. I'll talk more in a moment about exactly what that is, but it's not our everyday language. It's more sophisticated language. It's the language of text, okay? They have to work with the sentences, and I mentioned a few words about this already. Some sentences are really dense, lots and lots of ideas, lots of embedded phrases and clauses, right? And that makes them long. They also have to work with structure. Have you thought about the fact that different logical relationships are conveyed by different sentence types? Think about when you teach kids writing and you teach them different sentence types, and you teach them simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences, right? That's where you start. Well, simple sentences, although some aren't quite so simple, convey how many ideas, basically? Yeah. What about compound sentences? And they're related to one another, right? And what about complex sentences? Usually two ideas, one subordinate to the other. Those are different relationships. By the way, there's a lot of connection between writing and comprehension. Don't miss your opportunity here. Connect as often as you can. Reading, comprehension, and writing. Okay. So also you have to teach them about cohesive ties and connectives, and I just gave you an example. Benjamin Banneker was a well-known surveyor during the Revolutionary War. Who's the surveyor? Oh, that's a synonym or substitution for Benjamin Banneker. Or it might even be in the next sentence, okay? But you have to teach them that that's how you integrate ideas within and between sentences. Okay? That's actually a type of inferencing, by the way. I know we think about inferencing as filling in the gaps, but that integration of meaning within and between sentences is called local coherence inferencing. In other words, the ideas are hanging together in a meaningful way at the sentence level. And you have to infer that based on the use of these little words like pronoun reference and synonyms and so on. Okay. Background knowledge, schema required. Did you know that text structure is a specialized type of background knowledge? Yeah. Or knowledge in general? Yeah, it is. So we have to directly teach that so that when they come to text, that's automatic. That process, that skill just bubbles right to the top. They don't have to say to themselves, oh, self, this is a narrative text, I guess I'll look for characters. When's the last time you did that? When you read a good novel. Okay, it's automatic. Yeah. Okay, and then I put the inference piece. You cannot make inference without background knowledge. You can teach kids till the cows come home strategies for inference. If they don't have the background knowledge, they can't infer. It's not going to happen, right? Because it's not there in the text. The author didn't include it. The author assumed that you would bring a knowledge base that would allow for you to infer. And what's the goal here as Kayla is working with her placard, with her text, as she's interacting, because the text is presenting challenges, she's bringing her processes and skills. You've said to her, I want you to be able to tell me what that was all about. Retell or summary. Retell in your own words, summary, not in your own words. Or what was the big idea, right? She's building toward this coherent representation of text. And coherence is really just that the ideas hang together in a meaningful way. And that your child, right? Not all authors are coherent, by the way. Right? That your child, your student, is able to fill in and make sense out of what it is that they're reading. So they work with the surface code. Here's some new terminology. Remember I said one bite at a time? Okay, so don't get overwhelmed with the terminology, but they work with the surface code. Those are the exact words and syntax the author uses. When you ask your kids, write their questions, literal questions, you're asking them questions that's right at the surface. It's the surface code, okay? They work with the text base, the words that the author provided, right? But also with their background knowledge, kind of incorporating, integrating, figuring out what's implied, what's right below the surface. And then they create, hopefully, this coherent representation of text or mental model. That's your goal in reading comprehension, moving from literal to inferential, basically, to this overall understanding of the text. Now, I mentioned cognitive processes, right? I said, okay, so those are the language processes. So we can look at the language strands of the rope. We can look at what Kate Kane tells us. Already you should be thinking about instructional implications. Wow, I really have to teach a lot of stuff when I teach comprehension. I can't just pre-teach those vocabulary words. It's not going to be enough. I can't just rely on those questions that come at the end. That's not enough. I need to think about my students and all those other things that are going into the making of meaning. So as your students working through the text, these are cognitive processes represented by Judith Irwin. They're pretty simplified. They're using those language processes to do what? Microprocess. They're identifying idea units, right? They're using the surface level of the text, they're using the words, and they're coming up with the idea units. That's right there in the text, right? But then they're beginning to integrate those idea units. So they're working within and between sentences. They're still working at the surface level of the text, but they understand that the author is using these little cohesive ties or little signal words to tie up meaning, right? They're also being metacognitive. They're kind of hovering above their own reading. You're kind of hovering above my words right now and thinking, wow, am I understanding what she's saying or not? Maybe I better ask a question when she gives me an opportunity, all right? They're elaborating, bringing forward their background knowledge. I hope you're doing that as well as you're listening, all right? In this case, we're talking about reading. And then macro processes, kind of putting it all together, summarizing it, walking away with the big understanding. So this is what our kiddos go through. And this is simplified in comparison to some of the models that are out there. But hopefully it makes sense to you, because what I'm trying to convey is this is complex. This is not a set of questions, right? So one bite at a time. Think about this, one bite at a time. So no wonder our kids sometimes have difficulty comprehending, right? No wonder. Okay. So comprehension, it's a dynamic interaction between the reader, the text, and the instructional context. You are the context. You're the informed educator. You're providing the scaffolds and support that are necessary for your students to be able to develop those processes and skills. Construction occurs moment by moment. So, comprehension is very active, right? And it's not a step-by-step, sometimes it's recursive, right? It's a very active process. The reader proceeds through the text within the conditions set by the text. Think about, your lexiles and what they're derived from. They're derived from some of these things I've just been talking about, syntax, vocabulary, and so on. Okay. So texts present with their own challenges. Your student is coming with their challenges or their capabilities or their capabilities, and you're setting purpose for them, and you're surrounding them with the support and the instruction that's necessary to make meaning. So just take a moment, kind of take a deep breath, all right? Turn to the person sitting next to you and either surface a question that you want to ask me in a few minutes, or just a quick understanding of what I've just said, something that was relevant to you. Either maybe it's a new learning, maybe it's something you immediately connected with, right? So either surface a question or something that you just can't wait to share with the person sitting next to you. Go ahead, let's take a minute to do it.
There's a lot to it. It's deep and it's not easy.
I have students that struggle at the decoding, so we never get to move on.
I'll just take a minute if anyone wants to make a comment or ask a question. Yes. Comment or question. Are you overwhelmed? Oh, I hope you're not overwhelmed. Did you say you were overwhelmed? Okay, just hang in there. It'll be all right. Remember, a little bit at a time, all right? And each of these language processes that I've just talked about, they're in the blueprint, so we're going to go through each of them, okay? I know it's a lot. It's just, you know what? There's no way to make comprehension easy. I wish I could make it easier. I keep struggling, but keep giving me feedback, and maybe you'll help me to do that. Yeah.
I have several EL children that are struggling greatly.
Yes.
And this kind of helps me understand a little bit more why.
Good. Yeah, that's good.
Language and
Yeah. I'm going to talk for a moment here about the struggling comprehender, and certainly some of our children who are working to attain proficiency in another language really have to work hard to acquire the vocabulary. They have to work hard to acquire, in some cases, the background knowledge. There are cultural differences. You said that. There are cultural differences. Yeah. So I was just thinking about that even in terms of, I'm working on a book with this title. And I was trying to think a little bit about background knowledge and the differences and give a concrete example. And I have examples of text throughout the book. In fact, some of them are right there. There's an article for 6th or 7th graders on Common Lit. It's called The Founding of American Democracy. And I kept thinking about that term democracy, what it means to us versus what it might mean to a child from another country. What do they bring? And so one of the things we have to be thinking about is surfacing what they know and trying to connect to what they know and build on that. But it's a huge struggle, I know it is. All right, so here's some examples of some kiddos and what we ask them to read, age and grade appropriate text as well. So here's Lily, and she's an incoming 8th grader. And what was she asked to read? Animal Farm. You all remember Animal Farm, probably. And informational texts about dictatorship, including one about Stalin. Let me tell you, I'll show you some language from that in a few minutes. Whew. All right. And then you've got Matt. He's a 5th grader. He's struggling with Tuck Everlasting. Maybe some of you have read that. That big idea from that is immortality. All right. And then Kayla's reading The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy. You have a copy of that. All right. She's a 3rd grader. Or 4th, I should say. In 3rd grade, Jermaine is reading about Rosa Parks. Right? Maria's listening to Frog Goes to Dinner. She's not reading quite yet. And some of those others might be listening as well. Okay. Each of these kiddos are coming with different abilities, interests, and experiences, right? And yet they're going to be asked to respond to tasks that are pretty high level. So there's going to be a lot of challenge for them. If we just think about these two students, again for a moment, you know, Jermaine, he's reading about Rosa Parks. His listening comprehension skills are strong, so he's got language, right? He's got language, right? But he struggles with word recognition. So what are we going to have to do for Jermaine? We want to keep developing those listening comprehension, the language for him. We're going to have to give him access to print, right? Until he acquires. So he's not able to read selected grade appropriate texts, but he listens as his teacher reads or assistive technology does it for him, right? Matt, on the other hand, struggles as he reads Tuck Everlasting. He has language difficulties, right? And while he can read all the words, right, he's struggling with the understanding of words, sentence, and overall text. So our struggling comprehenders are struggling for different reasons, and we have to be aware of that, right? We have to be thinking about that. There are different reasons why students struggle, and one certainly is the ELL student, right? Certainly children of poverty, right? Oftentimes they don't have access to the development of oral language capabilities, whether that's through quality preschool or being surrounded by language or access to books, whatever, right? And certainly our dyslexic students. And yes, typically, when we talk about dyslexic students, we say they have strong listening comprehension. But what happens when they don't have access to age and grade appropriate texts? The definition of dyslexia directly addresses it. If they have reduced access, then the vocabulary and the background knowledge that they need as they work with these more advanced texts begins to diminish. Okay. We also have students with dyslexia who have co-occurring conditions, attentional issues, for instance, or perhaps specific language impairment. And so this, again, is something we have to be thinking about in terms of why are they struggling. And being able, you see, by having an understanding of what goes into comprehension, what all these different processes and skills are, we're not simply going to say the child has a comprehension problem. I mean, that's important to identify that, right? And in fact, some say that we shouldn't be calling it comprehension problems, we should call them language comprehension problems. Love that, right? But we don't want to just say that they have language comprehension problems or reading comprehension problems. We want to start to get more specific. And by understanding what these components or contributors are, we get better at differentiating, we get better at analyzing the responses that our students, their products, so that we can target our instruction. What I'm talking about today is effective instruction for all kids. And we make good decisions about what we're going to focus on dependent upon the students in front of us. For those students who are struggling, we have to really fine-tune our instruction. We not only have to give them opportunity to develop all these language processes and skills, we have to begin to target where are they having difficulty. And if we don't understand what goes into this, that's pretty difficult for us to do. Okay. Kate Kane adds just a little bit to this in terms of talking specifically about kiddos who are just poor comprehenders, right? And she says oftentimes they have difficulty with text processing skills, this integration and inference making, comprehension monitoring, and even knowledge of story structure. You know, sometimes kids have a knowledge base of text structures, they just don't use it. They don't use it. Okay. So struggling comprehenders. Okay. So time to share. All right, I gave you an opportunity a few moments ago, but I want you to think about this question. In what ways has your mental model, your overall understanding of reading comprehension changed since we began this morning? Remember, think about what we talked about. We did a little background knowledge in terms of language. We talked about the reading rope. We talked about Kate Kane. This definition of comprehension, being very focused on language processes and skills, not so much product-oriented. And then we've just had some additional conversation about the struggling comprehender. So I'll give you a moment to think, and then I'm going to take hands in terms of in what ways has your mental model changed? Or what question do you want to ask me at this point? Okay. Anyone want to make a comment or ask a question? What are y'all thinking?
I'm thinking that I have a really good handle on the decoding part and all the parts that go into helping someone decode. And I feel like I've just begun teaching Tier 3 reading comprehension, and I can see that there are lots of complicated things that go into this, and I've been trying to break it down on my own and figure it out. And so I feel like I'm on the verge of really having specific names and strategies for all the things that go into comprehension. I'm excited.
Okay, that's great. You know, that's the way I felt when I first started to talk about comprehension. You know, I was with Susan for a while, a national LETRS trainer, and one of the modules dealt with comprehension, and I went into that thinking, wow, this will be just fine. And I was like, oh, what don't I know? Which really started me on this path, yeah. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Thoughts or questions? Yeah, Courtney.
I just finished my dyslexia therapy training, and I have dyslexia. I've been struggling with, they're reading, and now they can read in code words that they don't know. What do I do now? How am I going to get them from learning how to read to become reading to learn? Because that transition is what this is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to say to all of you, as you're working with your decodable text with your kiddos, make certain that you're doing read-alouds with rich, high-quality text. Keep building that knowledge. So, you know, when you look at this reading rope that's on the chart behind me, Hollis never intended that you would just focus on the lower strands when you're teaching your little ones or your bigger ones who still are struggling with word recognition. She never intended that you would just work on those strands. She always intended that you would also work on those upper strands. And yes, in the lower grades, our focus is on the lower strands, but at the same time, we have to be developing the oral language, and we do that through listening comprehension with our younger students. And we can even continue to do that with our older students as we're teaching them to decode. That's really important. And then we have to be able to make this transition to more difficult text, and you have to know how to scaffold. Sometimes we take it a chapter at a time or a paragraph at a time, you know, in terms of what's critical for them to take away from the text. Okay, any other questions or comments? Thank you for those. I have 4 minutes to do the blueprint. You know, I have an agenda. So in 4 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to the blueprint. And this is really the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. Up till now, we've really been doing background knowledge for you, because I always want people to understand, where did she get that from? Where did that thinking come from? How can I explain why I might even think about using this as a master plan? So you have an assignment again. This is a quick read. In your participant guide, I want you to do a little quick reading in terms of how I describe the blueprint. All right, when you're finished reading, look up. All right, are we good? Yeah? All right. So just some key points about the blueprint. So today, for the rest of today, I'm not going to talk to you about a lesson plan. You can derive a lesson plan from the blueprint, but I'm going to talk to you about a master plan, a guide for organizing your instruction. A guide that is based on what? It's based on both process and product, developing those language processes and skills so that your student can meet product demands. It's going to help you organize and scaffold your lessons. You're not going to be able to do all the components of the blueprint, all those language processes in one day. You're going to have to be purposeful about what you're focusing on and when and for whom. Right? It also calls for the use of evidence-based strategies and activities. So I'm going to give you a variety of examples of strategies and activities, not one, but a variety. And I'm going to ask you to think about what you're currently doing and how that aligns with what I'm saying the evidence tells us we should be doing. Right? I couldn't possibly talk to you about all the strategies for vocabulary in an hour, or in a day, or maybe even in 2 days, right? That's why you go to workshops that are just on vocabulary. But we're going to highlight how the blueprint addresses that. I'm also going to talk to you about the fact that the blueprint allows for flexibility. So some of you are working with Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 students. So sometimes you have to deliver with more intensity, with more scaffolding. Sometimes you have to be more focused. It also allows for flexibility in terms of choice of text, although there are some guidelines. It's going to allow for flexibility in choice of your strategies and activities. Okay. I want to recognize that we all face different challenges. Our students are all different. It acknowledges the metacognitive nature of teaching. So the blueprint itself, which looks like this, all right, on the left-hand side, all right, identifies the different components. On the right-hand side are questions that you as the educator should be asking yourself about each one of those components. And those questions are based on what we know works, what the evidence has told us in terms of why it's important, what the meaning is, and how you go about addressing it. So what we'll do when you come back from break is we'll start on some of those preparatory pieces for using Blueprint, like, what do I mean by enduring understandings or critical understandings, and what am I talking about with choice of text? And then we'll dive into vocabulary, sentence comprehension, text structures, and so on. Okay? Break time.